Studies indicate that the vast majority of serial killers are below the age of 30 and kill for enjoyment or for money. The motive may differ, but the method and end game is murder. Let's take a look at the most fascinating serial killers to roam this earth. Gary Ridgway appeared to be your average everyday quiet guy, just minding his own business. He would begin and end his day as a traveling man, driving to and from work regularly. Little did anyone know or suspect, Ridgway would be making frequent stops between 1982 and the year 2000, offering rides at times, at other times soliciting prostitutes for their services. With this method, over about 2 decades, Gary Ridgway would abduct, abuse, terrorize, and murder upwards of 90+ women. He targeted those who he felt society would easily dismiss and not mind or be alarmed by their absence. They had strayed from the safety of society into the speedy realm of the streets. Ridgway was waiting. His method of abduction, murder, and disappearing young women in the Seattle outskirts of Auburn, Washington, and the surrounding area would earn him the moniker of the Green River Killer. Ridgway would be caught by DNA evidence and convicted of the murder of 48 women, though he confessed to 75, and it is expected that the figure is more accurately in the range of the low 90s. Ridgway's own confession would grant him a deal to avoid the death penalty. His horrific legend is a lesson still used to warn young girls about straying away from safe harbor and approaching the strange man with the candy in his hand. Jane Taupin probably seemed like a good enough lady, a helper of people, a nurse in fact, doing her duty for those in need of medical and health aid at the turn of the 19th century. But helping others was not the only passion she had as a nurse. In fact, her passions were the patients themselves. Taupin, under the guise of providing food and medicine and other consumables, would poison her victims, not only to see them die, but to share the experience. It turned her on. Known as Jolly Jane, people would later morbidly learn what gave her jollies. She began her training as a nurse in 1885 and was known to endear herself to patients. Her first victims were especially endeared to her. They were her own parents, who served as her guinea pigs. Taupin enjoyed killing elderly and helpless people. In fact, quoted as saying her ambition was, quote, to have killed more people, helpless people, than any other man or woman who ever lived. It is unknown if she met the mark, but after poisoning her victims, she would lie with them as they died, receiving sexual gratification from the entire experience. Taupin's body count would meet the figure of 31 people. She was found guilty but faced no consequences or sentence due to being deemed insane and was instead confined to an insane asylum for the remainder of her life. Due to the poison of racism, Wayne Williams almost got away with murder. For him, racism, in this case, worked in his favor. Williams, a relatively young man at the time of the Atlanta child murder era of 1979 to 1981, certainly did not meet the traditional profile of a serial killer. Williams was a young African-American male, going against the grain and the predominant psychological profile of a serial killer, a young to middle-aged Caucasian male. Williams apparently went against the grain and tragically and horrifically broke this color line. He blended in and was a murderer, but not a suspect, in plain sight. Williams' spree of murder reigned for the better part of 3 years and is believed to have murdered up to 30 children, being found guilty of 23 victims, including 2 men. He was caught when someone heard a loud splash in the Chattahoochee River at about 2:50 a.m. one morning, and an automobile in the area at the time was identified as Williams. He would be questioned about a body that surfaced 2 days later, and he would fail 3 polygraphs horribly. Still, Williams would not be arrested immediately, but with more evidence, he was arrested, found guilty by a jury, and sentenced to life in prison, after which the killings ceased. Williams is a testament to the idea that what you see is not always what you get. William Bonin could be regarded as a relatively good-looking young man in the early 1980s. On the surface, he could blend into any scene on the sidewalk, a restaurant, or social setting. Beneath the surface, Bonin was described by a prosecutor as the most arch-evil person who ever existed. Big words, but not necessarily wrongly applied. Bonin reigned as a predator in the streets of Southern California during 2 terrifying years of 1979 and 1980. But even before Bonin took to preying upon the lives of young men, he was already a twice-paroled sex offender. Whatever impact those stints in prison and the justice system had on Bonin, they did not change him. Bonin would assault, rape, and murder 21 young men and boys that we know of over a 2-year span, earning the title of the Freeway Killer because he would leave the bodies of the majority of his victims alongside various Southern California freeways. Others also murdered and discarded bodies on the highway, but Bonin and his brutality gave him the distinction and horrendous moniker as he targeted hitchhikers, schoolboys, and some male prostitutes ages 12 to 19 years old, overpowering, subduing, binding, battering to death, and/or driving ice picks through the ears of victims were the methods of Bonin. He was convicted of 14 murders and sentenced to California's death row, where he was executed in 1996. At the time of his death, Bonin was suspected in the murders of 15 more victims. A good date can be hard to find for those living the single life. The wrong date could not be worse than one with Jeffrey Dahmer. When someone says, "I'll have you over for dinner," the phrase is usually not taken literally. Unfortunately for 17 young men and boys, Dahmer meant exactly that. Under the guise of a homosexual encounter, Dahmer, from the late 1970s until his capture in 1991, would entice and lure victims to his Milwaukee, Wisconsin area apartment, where after engaging in some likely agreeable activities, would incapacitate his victims. This method would lead to his earning of the titles the Milwaukee Cannibal and the Milwaukee Monster. After his victims were drugged or induced into some form of mind-altering condition, Dahmer would begin his sexual assaults, which led to murder and sexual activity after death. Yes, Dahmer was a necrophiliac, having sex with dead bodies, dismembering and preserving body parts by placing them in his freezer and attempting to dissolve other body parts in vats of acid. Again, the severity of Dahmer was preventable, as on one occasion, a man was seen running from Dahmer's apartment naked and bleeding from his rectum, only for police on the scene to be convinced by Dahmer that the man was his boyfriend under the influence of alcohol after some kind of lover's quarrel. The man would later be found among Dahmer's victims. Finally, in 1991, Dahmer would be caught and arrested after a 5-hour date ended by his would-be victim overpowering and escaping Dahmer's putrid-smelling apartment. The would-be victim flagged down police, and upon arriving at Dahmer's apartment, they would encounter the smell of death and locate several skulls, a mummified head, a freshly severed head in the refrigerator, 4 decomposing torsos, a pair of severed hands, and 74 Polaroid photos of bodies in various stages of decomposition, among other horrific discoveries. Dahmer would be arrested and convicted of 16 murders, sentenced to prison where he himself would be killed by an inmate attack. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was the kind of guy you could trust, a great neighbor and friend who you would ask for and receive help from. One of the neighborhood rocks and foundations in the gang-ridden and drug-bedraggled streets of South Central or South Los Angeles. So when dead bodies of prostitutes and young women began appearing in the crack era of the 1980s, it drew alarm and concern, but less so than the more dramatic and volatile nature of gang violence that plagues the area even today. Franklin's spree of murder included a conviction and death sentence for the murder of 9 women and a teenage girl. However, authorities suspect Franklin in the murder or involvement in the missing status of approximately 180 women, of whom he kept a detailed library of photos. Amazingly, Franklin's case could have been closed in the mid-1980s had police done their job. A woman who escaped Franklin was shot, but the evidence was never investigated or matched to Franklin, which later evidence suggested it could have. In fact, a small association of concerned mothers were the only consistent force seeking Franklin, who was known as the Grim Sleeper. Arrested in 2007, Franklin was discovered by a detective posing as a restaurant waitstaff, where Franklin left the crust from a slice of pizza, and the DNA of Franklin matched that of multiple victims. Franklin was sentenced to death in 2016. What are your thoughts about our list of infamous serial killers? Let us know. Leave a comment, subscribe, and Click the notification symbol to stay updated and part of the Public Figures TV conversation. Until next time.